In this video, I want to show you how you can build your own developer console that works with API keys that work with Zuplo so that you can have self-serve API key management in your own experience. Zuplo by default has a developer portal that allows your users to come and self-serve their keys, roll them, view developer analytics, more on that coming soon, and much more. But sometimes some companies kind of want to take full control and manage this whole thing themselves, like our customer common paper, for example, that they have their own developer-facing experience and they wanted to embed the way that developers got their keys and rolled their keys into that experience. So if you want to do that, you have to use ZAPI, or the Zuplo API that you can see here. Just quickly, let me just show you how API keys work before we go and show you how you can use this new API. So I'm going to create a new project called Tomato Goldfish, obviously, or tomato, you know, that saying. And what we're going to do is use the UI here to create a new API key. First of all, though, let's just create a route that we're going to call /who am I. And what this is going to do is it's going to use a function. We're going to edit the hello world function here that echoes back details of the user. So return request.user. So notice how I'm accessing this programmatically. The user is a property of the request now, and that would work if you're using JOT tokens or basic authentication or anything. This will work, but it hydrates that object so that you can use it anywhere in your gateway. So it opens up a lot of really cool programming scenarios. And we're going to add API key authentication to this. So if you try and call this API without a token, let me just save all my changes there. If you try and call the API without an API key, you are going to get a nasty 401 that says no way. So let's just test that. My gateway is just waking up, so it might take a second. There we go. I got a 401 unauthorized. So as you can see, I wasn't able to make a successful call, so I need an API key. Now I could go and use ZAPI to create my first API key. I'm gonna actually just head off and use the UI for a second. So I can come in here to create an API key on the UI that just calls the same ZAPI API in the back end. I'm gonna call this consumer test. Now managers are people who have rights to manage your API key. That's really only useful if you're using our managed developer portal. I'm not going to be using it in this example, so I'm not going to set that, but we should set some metadata, and the metadata is going to be account number, let's pretend, is 1. This is account 1 of our system. It's like a foreign key, perhaps, to another system. So I'm going to click save on that. I will copy this key to the clipboard here, and I'm going to head back to that test client. Test it, type in authorization. Paste in my key, and boom, there you go. It echoed back that the sub is test and the account number is 1 for that user. Pretty cool. Okay, now, what if I didn't want to use this UI? This API key consumers UI. What if I actually wanted to use the management API? Well, as you can see, there is ZAPI here, and it tells me how to create consumers, how to list consumers, how to create keys and list keys. Now, important pause here for a moment. What is a consumer and what is an API key? When you think about the best API key experiences, they usually have an identity represented by a key. So that might be an organization or a particular team within an organization or just a particular set of scopes within an organization. And then that has a key or a password, basically, associated with it. One thing that's important, though, is that you can roll that password or roll that key. And what rolling does is it typically sets some expiry on the previous key that gives you a little bit of a window to change to a new key and creates a new key. But that key's got to map to that same identity. So that's why we have the notion of consumers and keys. A consumer is the thing that can have multiple passwords, that contains the metadata, that contains the tags that I do searches by that I'll show you in a minute. The key is just a password that is much more transient, much more short-lived, and much less interesting. So you can have many of those. We actually have a built-in role endpoint that helps you with this stuff that I'll mention in a minute. So let's go and create our first consumer. That's what's really interesting. So let's go to create consumer. Let's just copy this, and I'm going to use the terminal here. The output's not going to be super pretty in JSON, but I think you'll be able to follow along. So I'm going to paste this in, and it's a post. I actually need to replace this whole section here with the bucket name, the bucket URL for my account and bucket. So let's go and get that. You can see it in project information here. It tells me what my bucket name is. It tells me what my account name is. So I could paste them in, or I can just grab the whole thing here and head back over to Warp, paste that in, and it should end in /consumers. Now there's an interesting query string on here that says with API key equals true. What that will do is, by default, it will create the consumer with one API key. If you don't specify that, you'll get no API keys in your consumer. I want an API key by default. Who doesn't really? So let's choose that option. But let's just change some of the data that we're creating here. So test 2, description can be any text. You often let your user set this. So test key number 2. Tags, let's do color is red. That might be org ID is sales east or something. We can set the metadata. Let's do account number. And let's make this 2. And then again, we're not going to be using the Zuplo portal in this case, so we can get rid of managers, but you could also set them programmatically if you needed to here. Okay, so let's execute this command. Oops, I'm going to need an API key. So where do I get the API key to call ZAPI? Well, it will be in your Zuplo API keys down here. So I'm just going to come in, copy that, head back here, paste this in. I'm going to trust you folks not to steal it. I'm going to delete this project by the time you get the videos published anyway. Let's hit this, and that should create us our first API key. Pretty awesome. And you can see that because we use the with API key true option, it actually returned me a full API key. So let's grab that, let's copy that, and let's head back over to the test client in here. On the whoami method, we're going to replace that key with this one, and I get test 2 as the sub and account number is 2. So pretty cool. It's working. I just created my own API key. Of course, I can get these out programmatically. So I can use the list command, which will see list consumers here. Let's copy this, head back over to Warp. We're going to paste that curl command in. And I want to steal the first part of that URL again. Up to bucket name here. I've got an extra E, paste that in, and I want to include API keys in the result. I don't need to include anything else right now, and let's just delete that. Okay, so now I'm saying include API keys. I need to paste in that ZAPI key here, and hopefully this will give me back all my API keys. So it does. Now, one thing I want you to notice though, you see these stars for the key? For the actual key, it's starred out, and that's because we have a few options. When you retrieve or list consumers or API keys from Zuplo, by default, it's going to give it you in a masked way because you might not need to display it to the user. In that case, you shouldn't pull the key out. You shouldn't have it in memory in the browser or anything really, just security in depth, right? But you can request it if you want. You can come back and request an individual key using the get key operation as well. But the way you set this is on list consumers. You'll see here there's a key format of non-visible or masked. So let's go back and let's add that to the query string here. And key format equals visible. And now I can see the full API key. So if I go and find that first one, we'll probably find our first user that I created in the UI, remember? And there we go, account 1. So pretty easy. Now, we have a tags feature. If you remember, when I created this command, I set a tag of color is red. What that is used for is used as for foreign key searches on the API. So let's imagine I wanted to get out all of the consumers that had a tag of red. Then that's pretty easy for me to do as well. I would simply go back to that list command that we just used. And I would say, and tag.color equals red. Now this is really useful if you want to call this API via a simple auth translation layer and get out all of the keys that map to a particular organization or a particular user. You can use these tags as a kind of foreign key into your own database. And so notice I only got one key back this time, and go and replace it with this, and that should be key 2 because that was the only one that I tagged with that. Notice the tags don't come back in the data. You can duplicate the tag in the metadata if you want it there, but by default, it might contain different or secure information you don't want available in the gateway. And so we didn't include tags in the gateway runtime by default. But it's very easy. You just duplicate it into the metadata if you need to. So that's a pretty quick tour of the ZAPI API and how you can use the new API key management features here. The last thing I want to mention is the ability to roll a key. So you can programmatically patch keys, you can set them to expire, you can delete them, you can do the same with a consumer. But the most common pattern, the most common thing people want to do is to roll keys. And what that means is they want to take all non-expiring keys and set them to expire at some period, like 7 days or 1 hour, and create a new key. Now, why do they have them expire? Well, if you imagine you have some system that's actively using a key and you decide it's time to change that key, I think it might have leaked, or for whatever reason, you just do this every month. When you roll a key, you don't want it to die immediately because you can't cut and paste the key over fast enough to not take down your traffic. So you always have this rolling notion where there is some expiry time. You can do that programmatically. So what you do is you just say, I want any non-expiring keys to expire on this date. And you can add that to the current time, of course, and it will create a new key for you. You just call roll. So very handy feature. Does it in one atomic transaction. You could do this yourself with a bunch of orchestration, calling like patch keys to set expiries and list keys and do a loop. But hey, we tried to make this super easy for you. And the other cool thing is when you're doing an update, you can use that tag query parameter. So tag.color equals red. And we will not update a consumer. If you send that tag operation on the query string and that consumer doesn't have that tag, then we will come back with a HTTP error code that informs you that we couldn't update that because it didn't match the were clause. So you can think of that like a SQL update were clause, which is very handy, again, if you have an auth translation layer, which you'll be seeing more of over the next few days. So this was the first video from API Key Week, introducing the changes to the ZAPI API to make API key management much easier in your own developer console.